The grand chamber of the Galactic Parliament gleamed like a massive geode, its crystalline walls refracting light from 1,000 worlds across the assembled delegates. At its center, Ambassador Catherine Kate Reynolds stood alone at the podium, her midnight blue Earth diplomatic uniform a stark contrast against the chamber's prismatic shimmer. "Distinguished delegates," she began, her voice carrying the warmth that had become her trademark. "Surely we can discuss this like reasonable beings." "Enough." The booming voice of High Chancellor Zixtal cut through the chamber. His chitinous exoskeleton clicked as he rose from his elevated position. "We have tolerated Earth's peculiarities for far too long. This constant push for informal meetings and cultural exchanges undermines 10,000 years of parliamentary procedure." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. A Ventaxian representative, their floating gas-filled body pulsing with agitation, chimed in. "Just last week, she suggested we resolve the Proxima crisis with something called a potluck dinner." "Which worked, might I add," Kate interjected, allowing herself a small smile. "Amazing what sharing a meal can accomplish." "That's exactly the problem." The Mechanoid Consortium's representative whirred in frustration, their optical sensors flashing red. "You resolved a century-old mining dispute with baked goods and casual conversation. There were no formal protocols, no proper documentation. No bloodshed," Kate finished firmly. "No economic sanctions that would have starved millions. No tactical deployments that would have cost lives." The chamber erupted in overlapping arguments. Some species required universal translators just to argue properly, creating a cacophony of mechanical chirps and biological sounds. High Chancellor Zixtal slammed his ceremonial staff against the floor 3 times, restoring order. "We will now vote on Resolution 359X, the immediate removal of Earth's ambassador due to persistent violation of parliamentary norms and potential destabilization of galactic order." Kate watched as the holographic voting matrix materialized above the chamber. One by one, lights turned red as species after species voted for her removal. The Arcturians, at least, voted in her favor. They'd developed quite a taste for chocolate chip cookies during the mining dispute negotiations. The Centaurians followed suit, perhaps remembering how she'd spent 6 hours learning their intricate greeting dances just to make them feel welcomed. But 2 votes weren't nearly enough. "Resolution passes, 998 to 2, Zixtal announced with obvious satisfaction. "Security, escort the former ambassador from the chamber." Crystalline drones descended from their docking stations, their force fields humming to life as they surrounded Kate. She took one last look at the assembled delegates, seeing smug satisfaction on some faces, nervousness on others, and on a few of the older species representatives. Was that fear? Then Catherine Reynolds, the most successful diplomatic envoy in Earth's brief interstellar history, did something that sent chills through the chamber. She laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh or an angry one. It was the kind of laugh someone gives when watching a child about to learn a particularly memorable lesson the hard way. "You poor fools," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly through the suddenly silent chamber. "There's a reason Earth sent its friendliest face first. There's a reason they never sent the Nightmare Man." The crystalline drones began to escort her toward the exit. As she reached the grand doors, she turned one last time. "You know what the funny thing is? When they suggested sending him first, I argued against it, said it would be too extreme." Her smile faded just slightly. "I really hope I wasn't wrong." The doors closed behind her with a resonant boom, leaving the chamber in uneasy silence. High Chancellor Zixtal was about to call for the next order of business when his personal quantum pad chimed. The message was from Earth's Office of Interstellar Relations. "Replacement Ambassador en route. ETA. 48 hours. Suggestion: review the Arcturus Accords, specifically why they were necessary." In the back of the chamber, the Arcturian representative quietly began to weep. The celebration in the Parliament's Grand Lounge lasted precisely 6 minutes and 43 seconds before the HFY delegation arrived. The ancient species' crystalline bodies cast prismatic shadows as they glided through the crowd, their arrival silencing the self-congratulatory speeches mid-sentence. "We have broken containment protocol Omega-7, announced First Archivist Extol, their voice resonating through their crystalline form. The temporal archives could not be contained once we realized the significance of today's events." High Chancellor Zixtal nearly dropped his ceremonial chalice. "You broke containment. The HFY never break containment, not in 12,000 years of record-keeping." "The alternative was extinction-level ignorance," the first archivist replied. "Their central crystal matrix pulsed with urgent patterns of light. We have found fragments, echoes in the quantum archives. The human you call Nightmare Man, we have records of his passing." The celebration's ambient music died. Even the atmospheric processors seemed to quiet down. The first archivist projected a holographic display, ancient data streams flickering with age. Regal Massacre, standard date 2187. A coalition of Drachnid warships surrounded a human colony. Standard extinction protocols initiated. The hologram shifted, showing a massive fleet of predatory-looking ships. The human sent a single diplomatic vessel. One human emerged. A single human stopped the Regal Massacre. A younger delegate scoffed. "That's not possible." The Drachnid were apex predators, their battle rage legendary. "Correction," another HFY chimed in, their voice heavy with ancient data. "The human didn't stop the massacre. He showed the Drachnid something that made them stop themselves." The hologram flickered again, showing fragmented footage. A modest transport ship approaching the Drachnid fleet. A simple message requesting parley. Then, "The next section is heavily corrupted," the first archivist said. "We only have the aftermath." The entire Drachnid fleet retreated to their homeworld. They sued for peace within an hour. Their official surrender contained only one clause: never again send him. High Chancellor Zixtal's exoskeleton paled. What did this human show them? Unknown. The Drachnid sealed all records. Their only public statement was, "He showed us humanity unrestrained. We choose extinction over facing that again." The first archivist's crystals dimmed. The Drachnid, a species that evolved from apex predators, chose surrender over facing a single human again. The lounge erupted in nervous whispers. A junior delegate rushed in, their tentacles writhing with agitation. "Chancellor, Earth's response to the ambassador's expulsion. It's being decoded now." The message projected itself across the lounge's main screen. Diplomatic Corps acknowledges receipt of Ambassador Reynolds' expulsion. Replacement Ambassador Admiral James Nightmare Martinez. Ret. Standard diplomatic protocols suspended under Article 7 of the Arcturus Accords. Note: this was not our preferred option. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "The Arcturus Accords," someone whispered. "Weren't those written after?" After the 72 hours of mercy, the first archivist confirmed. "Another incident we have partial records of. A conflict that ended so decisively that 17 species voluntarily quarantined themselves rather than risk another human intervention." High Chancellor Zixtal slumped in his seat. "We need to call an emergency session. Perhaps we can vote to reinstate Ambassador Reynolds." "Too late," the first archivist interrupted, their crystalline form pulsing with urgent light patterns. "Our temporal arrays just detected his ship entering the system. The vessel. It absorbs our scans. Like looking into a void." The celebration room, designed to host thousands, suddenly felt very small and very vulnerable. Someone started pulling up historical records of Ambassador Reynolds' tenure. The mining dispute resolved with cookies, the trade agreement negotiated over coffee, the peace treaty signed after a shared meal. "She was trying to teach us," a Centaurian elder realized aloud. "All those informal meetings, those cultural exchanges. She was trying to help us understand humanity gradually, safely." The first archivist's final words hung in the air like a funeral bell. And now we will learn about humanity the hard way, just as the Drachnid did. In the distance, a ship that seemed to swallow light itself began its approach to the Parliament station. The Parliament's receding bay had never been so crowded, nor so quiet. 2,000 eyes of various evolutionary origins watched as the matte black ship completed its docking sequence without a sound. No engine flare, no mechanical whir, just the unsettling sensation of darkness settling into place. "Our sensors still can't penetrate it," muttered the docking chief, his third eye twitching nervously. "It's like the ship isn't even there." High Chancellor Zixtel stood at the forefront of the welcoming party, though welcoming seemed an optimistic term. The delegation had swelled to 3 times its normal size, not out of diplomatic courtesy, but because every species wanted to witness this moment firsthand. The ship's boarding ramp descended with a whisper of hydraulics, revealing a corridor that seemed to drink the station's bright lights. For several long moments, nothing emerged. Then, footsteps. Quiet, measured, with a slight uneven rhythm suggesting a limp. Admiral James "Nightmare" Martinez stepped into the light. Several delegates instinctively stepped back, not because he was imposing. At average height for a human male, with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, he looked more like a university professor than a legendary figure of terror. It was his eyes that made them retreat. They were kind eyes, understanding eyes, the eyes of someone who had seen exactly how far species could go and had decided to carry that burden for everyone else. "High Chancellor," Martine said, his voice soft but carrying easily across the bay. "I believe this is the part where you welcome me to Parliament Station." He smiled, and several security officers reached for weapons they weren't supposed to have brought. Zixtel's mandibles clicked nervously. "Admiral Martinez, the Parliament extends its greetings. We trust your journey was enlightening." Martinez finished, reaching into his simple diplomatic attaché case. "I had time to review some interesting historical documents." He withdrew an ancient medal, its surface scared and pitted. "I believe you'll recognize this." The collective intake of breath was audible. The Medal of the Arcturus Accords, awarded only once, to the individual who had made them necessary. "Perhaps," Martinez continued, limping forward with the aid of a simple cane, "we should proceed to my credential presentation. I've prepared a few remarks about diplomatic history, specifically about how certain conflicts were resolved." A young predictor-class species representative near the back suddenly collapsed, their precognitive abilities apparently showing them something that overloaded their neural pathways. Medical drones rushed to assist. "Oh dear," Martinez said, genuine concern in his voice. "Please convey my apologies to your colleague. I sometimes forget how my future actions can affect precognitive species. I'll try to be less decisive in my diplomatic approaches." The delegation began its traditional procession to the Grand Chamber, though no one seemed willing to walk directly beside the new ambassador. Martinez filled the silence with casual observations about the station's architecture, pausing occasionally to admire a design feature or ask a gentle question about structural integrity calculations. At the chamber's entrance, a brave junior delegate finally asked the question burning in everyone's minds. "Admiral, what exactly did you show the Drachnid fleet?" Martinez paused, looking at the young alien with those terrifyingly kind eyes. "I showed them humanity's capacity for peace," he said quietly, "and what we're willing to do to maintain it." He gestured to his cane, to his slight limp. This saving a Drachnid ship during a later joint operation. They couldn't understand why I'd risk my life for former enemies. He turned to address the entire delegation. "I trust we won't need any object lessons about humanity's dedication to peace during my tenure here." Ambassador Reynolds' methods were far more pleasant for everyone involved. His smile returned, gentle and grandfather-like. "Now, shall we proceed? I believe I have some credentials to present, and some very interesting historical footnotes to discuss." As the chamber doors opened, Several delegates realized something that made their blood run cold. They'd never actually seen him blink. The Regellian trade dispute had raged for 3 centuries before Admiral Martinez asked to sit in on the negotiations. He didn't request to mediate. He merely sat in the corner of Conference Room 7, drinking Earl Grey tea and occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. 4 hours into the deadlocked session, the Regellian war baron turned to Martinez. "You seem amused, human." Martinez glanced up from his notebook. "Oh, I was just calculating something interesting. Did you know your species' orbital defense grid has exactly 17 critical vulnerabilities? Fascinating engineering oversight." He took another sip of tea. "Though I suppose that's not as interesting as the Proxians' reliance on their lunar deuterium refineries. Terribly exposed, those refineries." Both delegation leaders froze. "Just a hobby of mine," Martins continued pleasantly. "Studying strategic weaknesses forces one to really appreciate architecture, logistics, defensive theory." He smiled. Tea. The trade agreement was signed 20 minutes later, with terms so generous that 3 other species filed formal protests about market destabilization. A week later, the Crimson Blade pirates began raiding Parliament's supply lines. After their 3rd successful hijacking, Martins requested permission to explain things to them. "Explain things?" High Chancellor Zixtal asked nervously. "Oh yes," Martins replied, marking his place in the quantum physics treatise he'd been reading. "I believe a short conversation about cause and effect might be enlightening for them." The Parliament granted permission, if only because denying him seemed somehow worse. Martins departed alone in his unsettling black ship. 2 days later, the entire Crimson Blade fleet warped into Parliament space, their notorious leader requesting immediate political asylum. "He showed us the numbers," the pirate captain babbled to intelligence officers, his cybernetic eyes glitching from stress. "The horrible, perfect numbers. What would happen if humans ever decided to?" The captain spent the next hour in trauma counseling. During the morning session 3 days later, Martinez attended his first full parliamentary debate. The topic was mineral rights in the Carina Nebula, with 12 species claiming ancestral ownership. "If I may," Martins said softly during a break in the shouting. The chamber fell silent so quickly that several anti-grav chairs crashed into their docking stations. "I've been reviewing the historical records of similar disputes," he continued, pulling out his notebook. "Particularly interesting cases where resource conflicts led to unfortunate escalations. I've prepared some calculations about potential outcome scenarios." He adjusted his reading glasses. "Would anyone like to see them?" Every delegation immediately discovered pressing reasons why their mineral claims needed further internal review. At the parliamentary cafe that afternoon, a junior delegate worked up the courage to sit near Martinez. "The things you show people," they asked, multifaceted eyes glinting with curiosity, "are they real? Simulations? Threats?" Martinez looked up from his crossword puzzle. "I've never shown anyone anything that wasn't already inside their own minds," he said quietly. "I just helped them understand the logical conclusions of their actions. The mathematics of consequence, you might say." He reached for his tea, and several nearby delegates flinched at the movement. "Ambassador Reynolds was trying to teach you something important, you know. That humans will always extend a hand in friendship first." His smile faded slightly. "I'm here to remind you why." "Is that why you carry that ancient medal? As a reminder?" "No," Martins said, his kind eyes suddenly distant. "The medal reminds me of the cost of failure, of what happens when diplomacy breaks down and species see only the paths to victory, never the roads to peace." He returned to his crossword. 4 down, 11 letters. Consequence of forgetting history. The junior delegate left quickly, unable to shake the feeling that they'd just had a conversation much more important than they'd realized. That evening, the Parliament's automated systems registered an unprecedented number of species, accessing historical records about human conflict resolution methods. The most frequently accessed file was Ambassador Reynolds' cookie recipe, attached to her last successful peace treaty. Junior Delegate Vexna wasn't supposed to have access to the Parliament's Omega-level archives, but being the only member of a species that could phase through quantum-encrypted barriers had its advantages. What she found in those archives kept her awake for 3 standard cycles. The file was labeled simply, 72 Hours of Mercy. "You don't understand," Vexna insisted, her translucent form flickering with agitation as she addressed the emergency session. "We've been thinking about this all wrong. The Nightmare Man isn't a warrior. He's a teacher." The assembled delegates murmured uneasily. High Chancellor Zixtal leaned forward. "Explain." Vexna activated the holographic display. The Drachnid incident wasn't just about stopping a massacre. It was about preventing all future massacres. The display showed fragments of classified footage. Martinez's ship approaching the Drachnid fleet, a simple transmission, and then he gave them a gift. Vexna continued. A simulation, but not of war, of understanding. The footage played. Martinez had provided the Drachnid with a neural-compatible simulation of humanity's entire military history. Not the battles, not the victories, but the aftermath. The cost. The weight of consequence that humans carried with them. He showed them what it means to be human, Vexna explained. A species that had mastered the art of war so thoroughly that they dedicated themselves to preventing it. He showed them what humans see when they look at conflict. Not glory, not conquest, but an absolute understanding of the price paid by all sides. The chamber was silent now, every species representative leaning forward. But the 72 Hours of Mercy, that was his masterpiece. Vexna's form pulsed with emotion. The Corexian Empire was about to deploy planet-killer weapons against 3 civilizations. They believed themselves unstoppable. Martinez requested 3 days to demonstrate something to their military leadership. She played the heavily redacted footage. Martinez had created a simulation so detailed, so perfect in its understanding of warfare's true cost, that it broke through centuries of Corexian military conditioning. He showed them humanity fighting with what he called reasonable motivation. Vexna said quietly, "Not for territory, not for resources, but to protect others, to end conflict permanently." The simulation showed what humans are capable of when they decide that the cost of victory is acceptable if it means no one else will ever have to pay it again. The footage showed Corexian military leaders emerging from the simulation. Many were weeping. Their supreme commander immediately ordered a full military stand-down. The Corexians didn't surrender because they were afraid of losing, Vexna explained. They surrendered because Martinez showed them what humans are willing to sacrifice to maintain peace. He showed them that humans had mastered warfare so completely that they could calculate the exact cost in lives, resources, and suffering, and then choose to pay that price themselves to spare others. High Chancellor Zixtal's exoskeleton had paled considerably. "Why? Why do you bring this to us now?" "Because I found his original service record," Vexna said, "before he became the Nightmare Man. He was a xenopsychologist, specializing in trauma recovery and peace psychology. He created the simulations not to threaten, but to teach, to show other species exactly why humans value peace so highly." The chamber doors opened silently, and Martinez stood there, leaning on his cane. "She's quite right, you know," he said softly, "though I'd hoped these lessons wouldn't be necessary again." He limped to the central podium. "I never showed anyone anything they weren't already capable of understanding. I just helped them see why humans work so hard to avoid conflict, because we know exactly what it costs. Every credit, every life, every moment of suffering. We can calculate it all." He smiled that grandfatherly smile. "That's what makes us scary, isn't it? Not that we're good at warfare, but that we understand it so perfectly we'll do anything to prevent it. Even become the monster under your bed." The chamber remained silent as Martinez pulled out his notebook. "Now then," he said pleasantly, "shall we discuss why trading sanctions are a particularly poor choice for today's agenda?" The emergency session of Parliament lasted 17 hours. Species representatives argued, threatened resignations, and in one case, attempted to evolve into a higher form of consciousness to escape the situation. The central question remained unchanged. How does one uninvite the boogeyman? We could simply apologize, suggested a Meridian representative, their crystalline form clouded with anxiety. Request Ambassador Reynolds return. I've already tried. High Chancellor Zixtal interrupted, his mandibles clicking rapidly. Earth's response was concerning. The massive display screen flickered to life, showing Ambassador Reynolds sitting in what appeared to be a beach chair, Earth's ocean visible behind her. She was wearing what humans called sunglasses and holding something called a Mai Tai. "Oh, hello Parliament," she said cheerfully. "I'm afraid I can't return right now. I'm on something humans call paid vacation. Fascinating concept. You should try it sometime. Besides," she took a sip from her drink, "I hear Admiral Martinez is doing a wonderful job. Did he show you his notebook yet?" Several delegates shuddered. "He has such a unique way of explaining things, doesn't he?" Reynolds continued, her smile knowing. "You know, when Earth first contacted alien life, there was a huge debate about how to approach interstellar diplomacy. Some suggested we lead with strength, others with technology." She leaned forward. "But we chose to lead with cookies. Please," Zixtal begged. "We understand our mistake." "Do you?" Reynolds' smile faded slightly. "Do you understand that every informal meeting, every cultural exchange, every seemingly unnecessary social interaction was carefully designed to help you understand humanity gradually, to help you see us as friends first, so you'd never have to see us as anything else?" The chamber was silent. "Jim," Admiral Martinez. He volunteered to be the one who carries the burden of showing species the alternative. "Do you know what that's cost him? To be feared, to be the nightmare, so that others can sleep peacefully." She finished her drink. "So no, I don't think I'll be coming back just yet. Some lessons need to be learned thoroughly." The transmission ended. "There has to be something we can do," a junior delegate whispered. As if on cue, Martinez limped into the chamber, a fresh cup of tea in one hand, his ever-present notebook in the other. "Fascinating discussion about my methods earlier," he said pleasantly, taking his seat. "Though you missed the most important part." He opened his notebook. Would anyone like to guess what that might be? No one spoke. No. Well, consider this. In every simulation, every demonstration I've ever given, I've never once shown a species anything they weren't already imagining. He sipped his tea. I simply helped them understand the full implications of their choices, the mathematics of consequence, you might say. But the Drachnid, someone started, showed themselves what would happen if they continued on their path. I merely provided the calculator. Martinez's kind eyes swept the chamber. Just as Ambassador Reynolds showed you what friendship could look like, if you chose to see it. He stood slowly, leaning on his cane. You know what the truly frightening thing about humans is. Not our capacity for warfare, but our capacity for friendship. We'll fight to protect those we consider friends with the same thorough dedication we show in preventing conflict. He smiled. Kate, Ambassador Reynolds, she was offering you that friendship freely. I'm here to help you understand the value of what you rejected. The chamber erupted in panicked discussions. Proposals were made to reinstate Reynolds immediately, to create new diplomatic positions, to rewrite parliamentary law if necessary. Martinez watched it all with that same gentle smile, making occasional notes in his book. Sir, a brave Centaurian approached him. What are you writing? Oh, just some calculations, Martinez replied. About how long it typically takes for species to understand the true cost of rejecting friendship. He closed his notebook. Would anyone like to see my findings? The parliamentary chamber cleared in record time. The Galactic Parliament faced its first true crisis in 3 centuries, when the Vorkath species declared their intention to cleanse newly discovered sentient life in the Carina sector. The chamber erupted in chaos as the Vorkath ambassador proudly announced their fleet's departure. Then Martinez cleared his throat. The chaos died instantly. For the first time since his arrival, the Admiral stood without his cane, walking smoothly to the central podium. The limp, they realized with growing unease, had been entirely voluntary. "Before we proceed with this vote," he said, his voice carrying that same grandfatherly warmth, "I'd like to share something with you. Not calculations this time. Not scenarios." He placed his notebook on the podium. "Today, I'd like to show you what humanity actually does when we're not preventing wars." The chamber's main display activated, showing multiple feeds from across the galaxy. A human medical team rushing into a plague zone on a distant world. Engineers working alongside alien species to stabilize a dying star. Marines evacuating civilians from a natural disaster, regardless of species. Right now, Martinez continued, there are 17 major humanitarian operations being conducted by humans across known space, 8 emergency response teams, 12 scientific collaborations to prevent extinction-level events on various worlds. His kind eyes swept the chamber, including 3 on Vorkath colony worlds. The Vorkath ambassador shifted uncomfortably. "You see, the interesting thing about humans isn't our capacity for warfare. It's our capacity for caring about species who would gladly see us dead." Martinez touched a control, and the feeds changed. This is from last month. A Vorkath mining colony experienced catastrophic failure. Their distress call was answered by the UES Mercy. The human crew spent 36 hours in radiation that was slowly killing them to save miners who had voted in favor of humanity's exclusion from their space. The images were undeniable. Human medical staff treating Vorkath children. Engineers working until they collapsed to stabilize failing environmental systems. "That's what makes us different," Martinez said softly. "Not that we're willing to fight. Any species can fight. We're different because we'll die to save people who hate us, help people who fear us, and protect people who would never do the same for us." He smiled. "That's why I accepted this role, you know. To be feared, to be the nightmare, so that others might understand. If this is what humans will do to save you, imagine what we'll do to protect you." He turned to the Vorkath ambassador. "Your fleet is currently heading towards 6 newly evolved species. Species that have just discovered music, art, and the joy of existence. You intend to end that existence because their neural patterns don't match your criteria for sentience." His smile faded slightly. "Would you like me to show you what humanity considers a proportional response to genocide?" The Vorkath ambassador's scales had paled to pure white. You wouldn't dare." "The consequences." "Oh, I've calculated the consequences," Martinez said pleasantly. "Would you like to see my notes? I've broken it down into simple mathematics, the cost in lives, resources, political capital, and exactly how much humanity is willing to pay to prevent another species from knowing the burden of guilt we carry." He opened his notebook. "But perhaps you prefer to see the alternative calculations. The ones about how many lives we could save together. How many species we could help evolve, grow, reach for the stars." His eyes, still kind, still understanding, met the ambassador's. "The choice, as always, is yours. Humanity will pay either price. The question is, which bill would you prefer to share?" The Vorkath ambassador stood shakily. I must contact my fleet. To recall them. 4. Further discussion." "Wonderful," Martinez beamed. "And while they're returning, perhaps we could discuss something Ambassador Reynolds introduced me to." He reached into his jacket. "I believe she called them chocolate chip cookies." The Parliament chamber, for the first time in its history, erupted in laughter born of pure relief. The parliamentary vote to create the position of dual ambassadorship was unanimous, though several species had to create new physiological functions just to express how thoroughly they agreed. The ceremony, held in the Grand Chamber, marked the first time in galactic history that a diplomatic position had been specifically designed around being terrified of one ambassador while being comforted by the presence of another. Ambassador Catherine Reynolds stood at the podium, looking tanned and refreshed from her vacation, a plate of fresh cookies on the lectern before her. Admiral Martinez sat in his usual corner, drinking tea and making notes in what everyone now knew was actually a book of cookie recipes and tea recommendations. "I want to thank the Parliament for this innovative solution," Reynolds began, her warm smile genuine. "Though I must admit, it's the first time in diplomatic history that good cop, living nightmare has been made official policy." Nervous laughter rippled through the chamber. Martins glanced up from his notebook and smiled. 3 delegates fainted. "But that's rather the point, isn't it?" Reynolds continued. "Humanity's greatest strength isn't our capacity for warfare or peace. It's our understanding of when each is necessary." She gestured to the cookies. "We'll always offer friendship first. The cookies, the cultural exchanges, the informal meetings, they're not just diplomacy. They're who we are." She looked over at Martinez, who nodded encouragingly. "And Jim, Admiral Martinez, he's also who we are. The part of us that understands exactly what it costs to maintain peace. The part willing to bear the burden of being feared so that others can feel safe enough to be friends." Martinez stood, walking to the podium without his cane. "Kate's being kind," he said softly. "I volunteered for this role because I understood something fundamental about humanity. Our greatest weapon isn't our ability to wage war, but our willingness to prevent it at any personal cost." He pulled out his notebook. "Would anyone like to see my calculations about the comparative costs of friendship versus fear?" The chamber collectively leaned back. "No." He smiled. "Then perhaps we could discuss Ambassador Reynolds' latest diplomatic innovation. I believe she's calling it a potluck summit." High Chancellor Zixtel, who had finally stopped flinching every time Martins moved, leaned forward. "Wait, what?" "Oh yes," Reynolds beamed. "Every species brings their version of comfort food. We share meals, stories, build connections. Much harder to consider aggressive action against someone after you've shared family recipes. And if that doesn't work," Martinez added pleasantly, "I have some fascinating nutritional calculations about the caloric requirements for sustained interstellar conflict." "Which won't be necessary," Reynolds interrupted smoothly, "because we're all friends here." "Right." The Parliament had never agreed to anything faster. As the ceremony concluded, a junior delegate approached Martins. "Sir, all those simulations, the calculations, the demonstrations, were they real?" Martinez's kind eyes crinkled with amusement. "Does it matter? The fear of consequence is often more effective than consequence itself, just as the hope of friendship is stronger than friendship demanded." He nodded toward Reynolds, who was teaching a group of delegates how to dump cookies in milk. Humanity's greatest achievement wasn't mastering warfare or peace. It was understanding that both serve the same purpose, protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He opened his notebook one last time. "Would you like to see my calculations on that?" The junior delegate decided they had urgent business elsewhere. Reynolds watched the delegate's hasty retreat and chuckled. "Still enjoying playing the boogeyman, Jim?" "Someone has to," he replied, making a note in his book. "Though I must say, your methods are far more pleasant. This new sugar cookie recipe, for instance." As the two ambassadors discussed baking temperatures and the mathematics of perfect cookie consistency, the Parliament realized something profound. Humanity's true strength wasn't in their capacity for violence or peace, but in their absolute dedication to preventing anyone from having to choose between the two. The dual ambassadorship became the most successful diplomatic innovation in galactic history. No one ever started a war during tea time. The consequences, everyone agreed, weren't worth contemplating. Especially not with Martinez sitting in the corner, smiling that grandfatherly smile, making notes in his book of cookies and consequences.